Good afternoon and welcome to Managerial Accounting. Today is day 9 out of 30 for the fall 2022 semester. As you can see on our work to do calendar, now that I seem to have figured this out in Brightspace, we can see what's coming up. Keep in mind that once you click on those direct links, they may disappear from your work to do. That doesn't mean you've submitted them for grading. This is based on your clicking in Brightspace, not your completion of items in CNow. So there's not that kind of a connection here. But today we'll be finishing up chapter 18. We'll pick up with exercise 5 in just a minute after we do some housekeeping kind of stuff. And so we'll finish chapter 18 today. Chapter 18 is the final chapter for our first exam. So the first exam covers chapters 15, 16, 17, and 18. Exercises should be completed by the end of the day today. Problems should be submitted by the end of the day on Thursday. On Thursday, we will be starting chapter 19, but what we do on Thursday in chapter 19 is not on the exam. So the exam only covers chapters 15 through 18. I do have a review session scheduled for tomorrow morning. That's Wednesday, September 21st from 10 to 11, and that's on Zoom. So you are welcome to join us if you can. Please do not skip another class or other obligation to attend. I do have a few students signed up for that already. If you want to attend, you need to sign up in Starfish, going into the My Courses area, and where you see the little box for our course, you can click on to schedule with me, and you'll see the drop-in review session as one of the options. So you do need to sign up in Brightspace because that's, or excuse me, in Starfish, because that's how you get the email that has the Zoom link that you need. So it is not the link for my office hours. It is a separate link specifically for the review session. So if you can attend that review session, that's great. If not, I will record it and post that recording tomorrow after the session ends. And so you can always watch some or all of it if you think it would be helpful. What I would expect that we would do in that review session is work on some of the practice, or maybe all of the practice exercises for the exam. Those practice exercises are also optional. They're not graded. I can see who did them. I can see your work if I wanted to go look, but they're not graded in any way. I do leave those review sessions open-ended, so if the people who are attending wanted to do something else, then that's what we would cover. But in general, I would expect we'd be working on some or all of those practice exercises. If you're coming to the review session, you should take a look, if you can, take a look at those practice exercises prior to coming to the review session. So if we need to prioritize which ones are most tricky or need the most time, then I will be able to respond accordingly, because there may not be enough time in that hour to go through all of them. The exam then, as I already said, covers chapters 15 through 18. There is a time limit on that exam. So the exams are the only things for this class that have a time limit of any kind. There's a 3-hour time limit on the exam unless you have accommodations. If you have accommodations, you need to make sure that you get me the letter from our accessibility services coordinator, Don Poole, which will tell me officially that you have access to extended time or whatever other accommodations you need. And so for the typical student, you have 3 hours to complete the exam once you begin. You can take that exam officially. The exam window is Thursday through Sunday, but in reality, the exam is open now. So if you finish chapter 18 today, you whip through the problem, you're feeling pretty confident, you're ready to go, you're welcome to take it tonight. You can take it tomorrow right after the review session if that works for you. So really any time between now and Sunday, I would strongly encourage you not to take the exam until you've completed the assignments in those 3 chapters, 15 through 18. I would also recommend, of course, that you look at the practice exercises and at least make sure you know how to do them, even if you don't do every single one, to make sure that you're well prepared for the exam. Also, for the exam, they are open book, open notes. So if you have a notebook, if you have anything that you've printed out from the exercises or the problems or anything like that, you just really need to be careful that you open the ebook before you open the exam, because once you open the exam, it wants to block you from opening the ebook. But as long as you open the book first, there's no issue. So make sure, and I'll put that in the announcements as a reminder, but please just make sure that you open the ebook, then start the exam. Okay. On either at the end of class today, if we have time, or on Thursday at the very beginning of class, we'll actually open the exam in CNOW. I will open the exam in CNOW. You shouldn't. I will open the exam in CNOW. So we'll look at what the questions are like, how many questions there are, so that you feel a little bit more comfortable with that as well. But we need to finish up our chapter first before we actually look at the exam. So any questions, anything before we keep working on chapter 18? Okay, so let me pull up this, and I'm going to do just a brief review of what we already talked about from chapter 18, and then we'll pick up with exercise 5. So if you haven't already opened your exercises, you want to do that while I'm just going through a brief review here. So chapter 18 is on activity-based costing, but to start the chapter last class, we were first talking about the traditional approach to allocating overhead, and that is using a single plant-wide rate to allocate all of our overhead. We then looked at a bit of an improvement on that, where at least we recognize multiple production departments that might have differing rates of cost for different products. And so we looked at a couple exercises related to that. What we're doing now, and what you did in the final exercise, exercise 4 that we looked at on Thursday, and I asked you to complete that on your own outside of class, is rather than looking at activity or at cost production department by department, we look at what type of activities are driving those costs. And so you see a bit of a diagram on the slide that shows the kind of the difference in allocating cost. As I pointed out to you last class, all of these different methods that we're talking about, all of them end up with the same total cost. And so if you're a company that's only producing one product, you're really going to use the approach that is the simplest for you, because it doesn't change your cost in total. And to clarify that, recognizing where your costs come from in the activity-based costing could help you to control your costs. So that is another advantage of using activity-based costing. But once you incur a cost, it's going to show up on, if it's a product cost, it's going to show up in somewhere in our product costing structure. The advantage of using something like activity-based costing is that it lets us recognize better where our costs are, what's causing our costs. And so, as I said, we can try to control them. We can make sure that we are pricing our product appropriately. And we talked about that last class. I gave you an example of what it would look like if we costed one product too high and the other product too low, the impact that would have on our sales and our profit margin in the long run. So again, where we're going to be going today, starting with exercise 5, is the concept of using activities to allocate our costs, and hopefully getting a better idea of where our costs come from, and therefore controlling them better, and possibly reducing or eliminating any wasteful expenditures. So you can see just a quick example here that we've identified some core activities. We have two departments, if you will, fabrication and assembly. And then derived from that, we have a few activities: setup, quality control inspections, and engineering changes. And so by identifying these activities that might occur in more than one department. So what we were looking at last week, last class, was the idea of allocating costs by department. Well, within multiple departments, you might be doing quality control inspections. You might have engineering changes. And so being able to allocate cost based on engineering changes, regardless of which department, whether it's fabrication or assembly, those are going to give us a better sense of our true cost associated with producing a product. One product, for example, might have many engineering changes, where another one is a more simple design, something that we've made time after time, and it may have no engineering changes. So it makes sense. The product that is more complicated or newer is going to bear more of the cost of these engineering changes. So we'll be going to our first exercise in just a moment to apply this, but you may want to make a note of the activity rate calculation. This looks very similar to what we did for the plant-wide, single plant-wide rate and the multiple department rates. But again, the cost is based on the activity, not the department. So what are you doing, not where is it physically located? But the concept of calculating the rate in advance based on the budgeted cost is very similar to the traditional approach. Not the only difference. The biggest difference is for a company using activity-based costing, they're going to have multiple activities, maybe 5, 6, 10, 20 activities. And so each one of those is going to have a separate cost and a separate rate of application. So in this case, we're calling it activity-based because it's out rather than allocation-based. We've been using that term allocation-based or cost driver. Now we're using the term activity-based, but it's the same concept. How much of it do we expect to happen within our production year? So let's go to our first exercise for today, and that is exercise 5. And this exercise focuses on just one specific activity for Nozama.com Incorporated, and that's the sales order processing. So for our exercise, for our example here, Nozama has budgeted $250,000 for the sales order processing function. So that could include activity that's happening in more than one department. It could include, some clerical work. It could include some, phone time. It could include some cost of the copier or whatever other equipment might be used for this sales order processing. But they expect to spend $250,000 on sales order processing, and that is based on their anticipated volume of 50,000 sales orders. And so simple math, $250,000 for 50,000 orders, we are going to allocate $5 per sales order. And so if you think about it, now this is going a little crazy here. If you think about it, an order that takes, that's an order, I don't know what we're selling, consumer electronics. So if it costs us $5 to process a sales order, that order is going to get $5 allocated to it, whether it's an order for one consumer electronic or 100,000 consumer electronics. The idea is taking and processing the order costs us the same regardless of the size of the order. If we allocated the cost of sales order processing based on, say, the number of line items or the total dollar amount on the order, that would unfairly penalize large volume orders that are probably actually saving us some money. They're ordering 100,000 items at a time, probably cheaper than ordering just 1 or 2 items at a time. And so this is going to give us a little bit better understanding of the cost associated with sales order processing than some other choices we could make for how to allocate that cost. Determine the amount of sales order processing cost associated with 30,000 sales orders then. 30,000 sales orders at $5 each. $150,000 would be allocated to that cost. Oops. So as I said, this example is just the very first step, because we've identified in this exercise just one single activity, that is sales order processing. But this company, Nozama.com, probably has a dozen or more activities. We want to be as general as possible. We definitely don't want to have 500 different activities, because each one of these activities is going to have its own budget, its own allocation rate. And every time we allocate cost, we're allocating it to all of those activities. So we want to make sure that we are as general as we can be without losing the extra benefit of having a better handle on our costs and what's causing them. So as we move on to our next exercise, in this exercise, Lonsdale Incorporated manufactures entry and dining room lighting fixtures. They've identified 5 activities associated with that. Each one of them has its own separate budget, and we've identified the activity base that would be the most meaningful. So our first step is to calculate, just as we did in the previous exercise, calculate the budgeted activity rate. So that's going to be based on the total budgeted cost. So for the casting department, $570,000, and the total expected usage of casting. So the activity base for casting is machine hours. We have in our budgeted amount here, we expect to use 19,000 machine hours. So here in part A, just grab my calculator. Here in part A, we're going to calculate the activity rate for casting. $570,000 divided by the total expected usage, 19,000 hours. And so we're budgeting $30 per machine hour for the casting activity. Okay, so again, we divided by the total expected usage of machine hours for casting. Now I'm just going to scroll down here, and actually I'm going to start a little table over here in my extra white space over here on the side. So we know that this company has 2 different products, entry and dining room light fixtures. And we know that we have 5 activities: casting, assembly, inspecting, setup, and materials handling. Okay. So because we just calculated the rate for casting, I want to keep going with that. So if you can just scroll up on yours a little bit, I can't scroll up on mine because I'm writing on the screen. But what you can see in this given table of information is that the entry lighting is expected to use 6,000 hours of machining. Everyone see that? 6,000 machine hours for entry lights. And that's at $30 per hour. So I'm just going to start my totals here. We expect to allocate $180,000 worth of activity cost for casting to the dining lights, the entry lights. For dining, That same table tells us that the dining lights are expected to use 13,000 hours of machining. And that's at $30 an hour for a total of 390,000. Everybody okay with where those numbers are coming from? Okay. So let's go ahead with assembly. So what do we have for assembly? Assembly is expected to cost $80,000. Now you'll notice that when we look, and we're basing that on direct labor hours as the activity base. So the total direct labor hours are expected to be 5,000. $80,000 of assembly cost divided by 5,000 hours gives us a rate of $16 per direct labor hour. It's the total dollars budgeted for the activity divided by the total expected level of that activity. And then what we are going to do next, just as we did in the for the casting, is we're taking the total cost of that activity and splitting it between the entry and the dining, the two products that we make. So if I were to add across here in the casting, the 180,000 that we allocated to entry plus 390 to dining, that would equal the total amount budgeted for casting. So you have a way of checking yourself, checking your math, because the allocation, as I already explained, the total cost remains unchanged. It's just how we split it between or among the products that we make. So for assembly, $16 per hour, and the entry lights are expected to take 3,000 direct labor hours. That's a total of $48,000 that we would allocate to assembly. And then the dining lights, go ahead and do those 2,000 hours at $16 per hour. And so if we were to add those together, 48 plus 32 is $80,000 for assembly. We know that we have allocated that in total, not any more or any less than the total budgeted amount. Is this making sense so far? Anyone with questions so far? Okay. I'm going to ask you then to try inspecting setup and materials on your own. And once you have that, you'll be able to find the total activity cost by adding up the totals in your table here. And where does it tell us? Okay, and the last line here in this table is units produced. So we expect to produce 6,000 entry lights and 3,000 dining lights. So once you have your totals, you'll be able to divide by those number of units produced and calculate your activity cost per unit. I'm going to pause the recording and ask you to complete that on your own. I'm going to complete mine on the screen, and I will restart the recording once I have finished, so you can check yourself. So I calculated the cost per unit for inspecting, setup, and materials handling in the same fashion, taking the total dollars budgeted, recognizing the activity base, and then dividing that total dollars by the total expected level of that activity. So I have all of those per unit costs for each activity. And then I was able to allocate or split up the total cost based on the expected usage for each one of the products. So again, most companies make more than 2 products. So we have a simplified example here where they've identified 5 activities and just 2 products, but you can imagine how much more complex this would get as you get into a more realistic scenario of a company that might make hundreds or even thousands of different products. Allocated those costs, and if you were to add up these totals, the 287,250 plus the 466,500, what you would find is that we have completely allocated this budgeted activity cost column here. And then the last step was to calculate the activity cost per unit. So this is the combined total of all 5 activities to make one lighting fixture, one for entry, one for dining room. So you can see that these are very different costs depending on which approach we might have used if we didn't use activity-based costing. Let's say we could have budgeted all of the cost as one overhead and used, let's say, machine hours or direct labor hours for our activity driver, our cost driver. That's how we would have done it under the traditional approach. All the costs in one cost pool, and we allocate them based on one activity or cost driver. So let's say we had chosen machine hours. What would the impact be? Well, the dining room light fixtures take more than twice as many machine hours as the entry lights. So they would have gotten about 2/3 of the total cost. If we had decided to use direct labor hours, on the other hand, you'll notice that entry lighting takes 50% more direct labor hours than dining. And so the entry lights would have ended up with about 60% of the total cost. As it is, as we drill down into these 5 different activities, recognizing that each product uses those activities at a differing rate. So you'll also notice the entry lighting, that's for twice as many lights as the dining room lighting fixtures. So when we use activity-based costing, we are able to see and recognize that the dining room lighting fixtures actually take a lot more of most of the activity. Machine hours and number of loads for half the units, the per unit usage of these is much higher. Any questions about that exercise? So this would be everything that we just did here would be done in the planning phase or the preliminary part of the management cycle when we're budgeting and trying to forecast what's going to happen during the actual production cycle. Okay, we'll keep going then. So in this next exercise, in exercise 7, we're looking at activity-based costing and seeing how, comparing it to the traditional single plant-wide factory overhead rate system, the system that we learned in chapter 16. And so in this, we're going to compare and contrast. What if we use the single plant-wide rate? We'll see that it's much faster, but what if we use the activity-based costing? Would we get better costs, even though it's more work? Would it be worth it? And so then in part D, we'll be answering questions about how is it different if it's different? Why is it different? And why would we bother with the extra work? And I will point out as we get started with this exercise, it's also the case for this exercise, they're still only identifying 2 activities, setup and production. So even though it's going to be more complicated, it could be much more complex than that. So it's really important that we are mindful of deciding to use activity-based costing because it actually results in a different and more accurate cost. This exercise says Handbrain Incorporated is considering a change to activity-based costing. The company produces 2 products, cell phones and tablet PCs, in a single production department. The production department is estimated to require 2,000 direct labor hours. The total indirect labor is budgeted to be 200,000. Time records from indirect labor employees reveal that they spend 30% of their time setting up production runs and 70% of their time supporting actual production. The following information about cell phones and tablet PCs was determined from the corporate record. So you can see how many setups and how many direct labor hours for each one of the two products. We're asked to round all of our per unit answers to the nearest cent. Determine the indirect labor cost per unit allocated to cell phones and tablet PCs under a single plant-wide factory overhead rate system if we use the direct labor hours as the allocation base. So let me just point out to you already, cell phones and tablet PCs use the same number of direct labor hours, right? For the same, so we're making 80,000 cell phones and we're making 80,000 tablet PCs. The cell phones take exactly the same number of direct labor hours. When we use direct labor hours then as our driver, we're going to allocate the same cost to both cell phones and tablet PCs because they use that cost driver, direct labor hours, at the same rate and at the same rate per unit. When we look at number of setups, though, what do we see? The tablet PCs require more than twice as many setups. And 30% of the time is spent setting up production runs. So tablet PCs really ought to get more of the setup cost because they have a lot more setups. Does that make sense? Okay. So our total indirect labor cost is $200,000. If we allocate that based on direct labor hours, $200,000. I should write this out on the screen so you can see where my calculation's coming from. $200,000 in direct labor, or excuse me, indirect labor cost. And that's for 2,000 direct labor hours. That's our allocation base. So 200,000 divided by 2,000, $100, whoops, put a dollar sign there, $100 per direct labor hour. For cell phones, we expect to incur 1,000 direct labor hours, and that's for 80,000 units. So 1,000 direct labor hours at $100 per means that we would be allocating, as I already pointed out to you, half of the cost, or $100,000, would go to cell phones, and that's for 80,000 cell phones. And so that is $1.25 per cell phone. I do not need to redo these calculations because I already pointed out to you it's the same number of direct labor hours, the same number of tablet PCs being produced. So the calculation for tablet PCs would be exactly the same, $1.25 each. Calculations right here on the screen if you wanted to see the whole thing. But when we look at these data that are provided in this table right here, we see that tablet PCs, as I already pointed out, take a lot more time in setups than the cell phones do. And so we should be recognizing that. So let's first calculate our budgeted activity cost, because we're given the total cost of $200,000, but 30% of that is for setups. So 30% of $200,000 for $60,000 would be the total cost for setups. And the other 70% of their time is supporting actual production. So that would be direct labor hours. How many setups do we have total? Remember, we're using the total, the plant-wide total, $4,000. So if it's $60,000 for the activity of production setups, divided by 4,000 individual setups, that would be $15 per setup. And we can do the same thing for production support, $140,000 in production support allocated across 2,000 direct labor hours would be $70 in support costs for each one of the actual direct labor hours. So remember, the direct labor are the people who are actually making the product. What we are talking about here is the support personnel, the indirect labor. Everybody good so far?
How did you do the 7 again?
Yep, I took the $140,000 that we had indicated, that's 70% of the total. And then we expect to have 2,000 direct labor hours. So to do our next step, we need to create our table, just like we did in the previous exercise. We need to get my writing implement up here. So for cell phones, we're going to be allocating $15 per setup times, from that table up above, cell phones have 1,200 setups. And then we're going to allocate $70 per direct labor hour, and cell phones have 1,000 direct labor hours. So if we can do that math, we'll know the total cost of indirect labor for the cell phones. And if I did my math correctly, that would be $88,000 allocated to cell phones. And that's for 80,000 cell phones. For $1.10 per cell phone in indirect labor cost. Comparing that to what we did in part A, when we used the single plant-wide factory overhead rate, we got $1.25 for each of the products. But now when we recognize, hey, cell phones don't take as much setup time as the tablets do, we allocate less overhead, less indirect labor cost to the cell phones, and it's going to be more to the tablet PCs. So $15 per setup for the tablets. And there are 2,800 setups we anticipate for tablets times, now it's the same direct labor cost because it takes the same number of hours. And if you're looking at these wondering, well, did we really have to go through all of that math? Couldn't we have just said, well, cell phones went down 15 cents, so tablet PCs must have gone up 15 cents? That is true for this exercise because we are making the same number of cell phones and tablet PCs. Otherwise, it would be a weighted average, not a straight average. The only thing we could have saved ourselves a little bit of time was we knew that the total indirect labor was 200,000, and we had already identified that 88,000 of that would be for the cell phones. So we could have simply subtracted that from the 200,000 to get this number. So we could have done that a little bit simpler, But we couldn't have gone, we could not have found the $1.40 per unit without, just by looking at this, without knowing that we make exactly the same number of cell phones and tablets. And let's go ahead and fill in our part D. Any questions about what we did so far? Okay, so let's fill in part D. The per unit indirect labor costs in A are distorted because setup activity is consumed by the products in a different ratio from the direct labor. And remember, we were using direct labor as our allocation base. So we ignored the fact in part A, we ignored the fact that setup costs aren't consumed at the same rate like direct labor is. And I have to read the rest of this. The blank costing method properly, okay, so the activity-based costing method properly allocates the setup-related activity so that the tablet PCs receive a larger portion of the setup activity cost because they use more of it, more than twice as many setups for tablets as for cell phones. The single rate system allocated overhead only on the basis of direct labor hours. Since the direct labor hours are equal for each product, the allocated indirect labor will also be equal. Then we're going to address one more question that you might have at this time. So with what we just said, well, they used direct labor hours as if all of the costs were equal, but they're not. So what would have happened if we had used number of setups? What would have happened if we used our number of setups as the allocation base? Well, that also would have resulted in a distortion because that would have been ignoring that direct labor hours, which is 70% of the cost, direct labor hours are equal. And if we allocated everything based on strictly the number of setups, we would have been allocating too much cost to tablet PCs. So in this exercise, in this circumstance, using activity-based costing, allowing us to separate and allocate each individually for setup and production support actually gives us the best possible cost of these options. Any questions? So you can see how this results in different costs. In total, the cost is still the same. And so that's why there is no requirement. If you think back to what you did in financial accounting, and we were, in many different chapters, we saw that there were different ways to accomplish the same thing, but there were very clear principles guiding what we could and couldn't do, how we had to report costs and so on. We don't have those same. We don't have that same guidance in managerial accounting or management accounting. This is all internal allocation of costs that we're looking at right now. In total, the costs that we would report on our financial statements are the same. God bless you. And so this is all based on internal decision making. And we have that flexibility to decide which approach we want to use, because either way, all of that cost is going to be reported on our financial statements that go to our external decision makers. Okay. Let's move on then to our next exercise. Anyone? Questions? Anything you want to talk about before we keep going? So let's go to number 8. Multiple production department factory overhead rate method. So this example is not activity-based costing because we are still allocating costs, or we're back to allocating costs based on department. And we're still using the same allocation base, but we're recognizing that that allocation base might have different totals within each department for the two products. As I've said many times, if we only have one product, we don't have to go through all of this, because there is no wrong way to split the cost, because we're not splitting them. They all go to that one product. But can you think of a single company that makes only one product that comes in only one size? I've never been able to come up with one. Even companies that only make one product, it usually comes in multiple sizes, right? So each one of those sizes might have a different cost associated with it. So I'm going to introduce this exercise, and then I'm going to pause the recording and ask you to try this one on your own, because it is another opportunity to reinforce what we covered last time. So this will be a good review. The exercise says Four Finger Appliance Company manufactures small kitchen appliances. The product line consists of blenders and toaster ovens. So we are simplifying. We only have two products. That's still not very realistic. If we can understand the concepts for two products, so we can easily expand upon that if the company makes a more realistic 100 products or 100,000 products. Four Finger Appliance presently uses the multiple production department factory overhead rate method. We have overhead split between assembly and test and pack. So those are not activities, those are departments. And that's part of what makes this different than the activity-based approach. The direct labor information for the production of 7,500 units of each product. So each product takes 3,000 direct labor hours. If we were to allocate the entire $306,000 based on the 3 + 3, 6,000 direct labor hours, we would miss that the assembly department costs more, and the assembly department is much more heavily used by the toaster oven. The cheaper department, the test and pack, is much more heavily used by blender and not used very much by toaster oven. So it would end up in a distorted product cost if we only used the single plant-wide approach, $306,000, 6,000 direct labor hours, and split it evenly between the two. So as I said, I'm going to pause the recording and ask you to try this on your own. First, you're going to calculate each cost separately, the rate of application, and then apply it to the blender and the toaster oven for each department. And then you can calculate the per unit by dividing by the 7,500 units that these budgeted numbers represent. Okay, so coming back to exercise 8, I found the assembly department cost by taking the total cost dividing by the 3,000 direct labor hours. I found $62 per direct labor hour. Same thing for test and pack, and I got $40 per direct labor hour. I then allocated that to each one of the products based on the usage table. $62 for assembly times the number of hours in assembly, and $40 for test and pack times the number of hours in test and pack to get the totals. And then I divided those totals by 7,500 units for each of the overhead per unit. And we'll keep going. Exercise 9 asks us to construct and interpret a product profitability report, allocating selling and administrative expenses. And so up to this point, we've been talking about overhead as it relates to manufacturing. However, we can do the same thing for our period costs, that is the selling and administrative costs. So if we want to know how profitable our generators are, we have our gross profit or gross margin here, but we also know that that needs to absorb some of this selling and administrative expenses. So if we're able to determine how much generators use of that selling and administrative, and how much air compressors use of that. You know, maybe there's a more fair way to allocate this than based on revenues or based on number of units sold. So the marketing management team was concerned that the selling and administrative expenses were not traced to the products. Marketing management believed that some products consumed larger amounts of selling and administrative expense than did other products. To verify this, the controller was asked to prepare a complete product profitability report using activity-based costing. And so again, they're going to take that $610,000 worth of selling and administrative expenses and do a deep analysis of what goes into that. What kind of activities are related to that? So activity-based costing takes a lot of time, especially on the front end when you're considering a switch from one of the more traditional approaches that are easier and more straightforward and take less, you know, maybe time and motion studies to figure out where does that $610,000 in selling and administrative expense come from. Now, I also need to remind you that for GAAP, generally accepted accounting principles, for financial accounting purposes, those selling and administrative expenses are going to be kept separate. Those are period expenses. They are not part of the cost of the product. And so they would not properly be allocated as if they were product costs. But for internal decision-making, it is important for us to recognize where those costs arise, whether one of these products is a heavier user than another. And that allows us to have a better handle on our actual profitability. As I've said in the past, it's important that we set a proper price to make sure that we are maintaining the profit margins that we want or believe we should have. The controller determined that selling and administrative expenses consisted of two activities: sales order processing and post-sale customer service. Again, this is probably an oversimplification. It is almost certain that this company does other activities than just sales order processing and post-sale customer service. Someone has to do their accounting. Someone has to do their tax filing. Someone has to handle their human resource function and so on. But we need to simplify this for the sake of our classroom exercises. The controller was able to determine the activity base and the activity rate for each activity. So again, that's part of the hard part, is knowing, well, what's the appropriate base for allocating this, and how much should we be budgeting for that. So sales order processing is going to be allocated based on sales orders, and the activity rate is $65 per sales order. So the first thing they did was take the $610,000 and divide it between the two activities. How much belongs to sales order processing? How much is triggered by post-sale customer service? Then they determined how to allocate it based on sales order, service requests. And then we had to estimate or budget how much would actually be used. So there are a total of 7,000 sales orders, 3,000 for generators and 4,000 for compressors. So let's go ahead and allocate our cost here. So our total cost for sales order processing for generators, they have 3,000 sales orders, and we're budgeting $65 per sales order. So those have already been calculated for us. This is going to be a little bit more straightforward than our previous exercises. The generators, 3,000 sales orders at $65 each, are going to incur a total of $195,000 for sales order processing. The air compressors, 4,000 sales orders at $65 each, for a total of $260,000. And adding those pieces together, of the $610,000 that we had for selling and administrative expenses, $455,000 is a result of sales order processing. Now we can do the same thing for the post-sale customer service. $200 per customer service request. Generators had 200 requests. And at $200 per request, air compressors had 550 requests. Oops. And so if we add those two together, the total cost for sales order processing plus post-sale customer service, the combined total, $610,000. And that is how much we knew should be allocated right here. So our final step, the first part of this is going to be simply from the given information. So go ahead and fill that in from the information that was given. Revenues, cost of goods sold, and gross profit are already allocated to generators and air compressors separately. It does tell us, by the way, it does tell us to enter all amounts as positive numbers. So we've talked about that in earlier exercises. If it says use negatives, you have to use negatives. If it says use positives, obviously you need to use positives. If it doesn't say, it will usually, every time I've looked, it will accept either a negative or a positive. So sometimes it's easier for us to use negatives to remind us to subtract. But in this case, it tells us not to do that, even though the given information did have negatives in there. And so what we're going to be doing differently than what was given at the beginning of the exercise is taking this $610,000 in total selling and administrative and breaking it out between generators and air compressors and the two activities. So this is simply going to be pulling in the data that we already calculated in the previous step. Oops, sales order processing for air compressors. And so what you'll notice here is that the compressors are getting, the air compressors are getting more cost allocated to them, primarily because they have more sales orders. And also because they have, well, I guess they have twice as many post-sale customer service. I guess that's, as far as percentages go, that's the bigger change, is that the air compressors apparently are heavy users of the post-sale customer service, where the generators, not so much. The income from operations then will be the gross profit minus the total selling and administrative per product. And what you'll notice is, as I pointed out to you before, our total income from operations is going to be exactly the same as it was under the traditional GAAP approach to reporting at the top. The income from operations that we report is going to remain exactly the same. We don't make more money or less money. We are just distributing or allocating those costs separately for the internal reporting of generators and air compressors. Gross profit as a percent of sales, you're going to take the total dollars from gross profit and divide by their revenues. This is a percentage, and it asks to round percentages to 2 decimal places. That does mean when they say that, they do mean 2 decimal places on the percentage. And then income from operations as a percent of sales, again, rounding to 2 decimal places. On the percentage. Everyone done up to this point? And so what you'll notice here, is that when we did not allocate the selling and administrative expenses, when we use the traditional financial reporting approach that we have here, where selling and administrative is simply added on at the end, tacked on at the end. When we don't do that, we look at just the gross profit by product. The 2 products, generators and air compressors, are evenly matched. That is, each one of them has a 30% gross profit. But when we do take this extra step of activity-based allocating those selling and administrative expenses to each product, it brings our income from each product down, because of course there's more expense. They had to both go down, but the air compressor went down significantly more, and we already pointed out why that was. Not only do they have more sales orders, but they also have more than twice as many service requests, and the service requests are pretty expensive at $200 each. The fact that they have more sales orders is significant because, we're talking about a factor of what, 10 larger than the number of sales requests. So even though the sales orders are much cheaper at $65 each, there's still a significantly higher number of them in total. And so that makes a big difference in how we view these 2 products. The air compressors have the lower income from operations to sales percentage because the product is a heavy user of the sales and service activities. Many factors cause the air compressors to have less income from operations. Oh, sorry, that should say heavy. I said heavy and I chose the wrong word. So that should say heavy. Okay, so hopefully you can see why doing this product profitability report gives us much more meaningful or useful information for decision making internally. Even though the bottom line, our income from operations, remains unchanged, it does give us a different sense of what's causing those costs to be what they are. And so maybe one result of this is we tell the air compressor people, hey, why are your customers such a heavy user? Why do we have so many service requests after the sale? Is there something you could do up front to cut down on those service requests? Because do you realize they're costing $200 each for that activity. When we weren't focused in on that, it becomes easy to not take that into account or not hold the air compressor product line accountable for the actual cost that it's generating. Okay, let's move on to our final exercise then for the chapter. And as is frequently the case, the last thing we're going to look at is, well, we're focused mostly on manufacturing companies this semester, but how can what we are learning here be used by other types of organizations, such as merchandising companies, or in this case, a service company? Crosswinds Hospital plans to use activity-based costing to assign hospital indirect costs to the care of patients. The hospital has identified the following activities and activity rates. So again, the hard part's been done for us. They've already decided the 5 activities that they're going to use. They've decided which activity base would be appropriate and calculated the cost for each one of those units. So we have 2 inpatients, Abel Putin and Cheryl Umit. Not sure how you would pronounce that. And for each one of them, we're told how much they used each one of those 5 activities. So I'm going to ask you to pause the recording, try this on your own, allocating the cost based on the per unit cost we have in the first chart, and then the actual usage by each one of those patients to determine the total activity cost for each patient. And then answer the questions, why is the total activity cost different? We can already see why it's going to be different. Cheryl was in for only 4 days while Abel was in for 6 days. She used fewer imaging, fewer physician orders, fewer tests, and half the operating room hours. So all of that is going to contribute to the difference in their total cost. She was a lighter user of each one of those 5 services or activities. So again, please pause the recording, try this on your own, and then restart when you are done. So since the hard part had really been done for us, we're able to pretty easily determine the activity cost associated with each patient. So for each one of the 5 activities, I took the activity level times the cost per unit that were given in the 2 previous charts. That comes out to $11,000 for Abel and $6,025 for Cheryl. Our answers then for part B, Abel Putin apparently had a different condition that required more extensive treatment. Thus, the activity cost to Abel is nearly 2 times that of the other patient. And we already pointed out that Abel was a heavier user if each one of the services, more room and meals, he was there for 6 days rather than 4. He had more images, more physician orders, more tests, and more operating room hours. So it stands to reason that his total cost would be higher. But if we did not use the activity-based costing, we may have missed at least some of that difference. We may have ended up, as we've already seen in previous exercises, with distorted costs that maybe we don't recognize that Abel took twice as much time in the operating room as Cheryl. And so we say each one of them had an operation, they get hit with 1 cost for using the operating room without taking into account how long and so on. And so that is the end of the exercises for chapter 18. Since we do have a little bit of time left in class, I'm going to take this last few minutes of class time to actually look at the exam and talk about that a little bit more. Any questions though on this exercise or anything from chapter 18 before we move on? Do you need me to leave this up for another moment? You're good. Okay. So let's take a look at the exam. As I said, please do not click on the exam yourself because it is, the exams are the only assignment we have this semester that are subject to a time limit. So we'll start with the exam 1 practice exercises. Remember, you'll find this under the assignments I can practice now or under all assignments. The default is to assignments I can take now, and the practice sets do not appear there because they're not graded. So I'm going to open the exam one practice set. You can see right there, it's not graded. Of course, there's no time limit on the practice set. There are 7 different questions on this exam practice set. And I think I already told you the whole reason I set, or the old mechanism that I used to set up this practice set, is I made the exam and then I looked at what's on the exam and I found similar exercises that we had not already done in class, but we had done something similar. So you can expect to find something similar to these both in the exercises from the chapter and on the exam. You can tell that this exercise, if you haven't noticed this pattern, you can tell that this exercise came from chapter 15. This one came from chapter 16, 17, and 18. So if you're looking at this exercise and saying, I don't have any idea how to do this, that gives you a little bit of a hint about where to go to try to look it up, to try to find more information. That same thing is true on the exam. Yep. So the first, let me put up my, get a little pointer here so it's easier to see. So the first 2 numbers in the exercise number is the chapter number. And it's that way on the exam as well. So if you're looking at a question on the exam and you're wanting to look something up, at least that gives you a start of, I need to go to chapter 16 or I need to go to chapter 17 to see what I'm looking for. There is a time limit on the exam. And so you really don't have time, even though it's plenty of time to take the exam if you're prepared, you really don't have time to look up every single question. In fact, as you'll see in a minute, many of the questions on the exam are similar to these exercises. So you can't really look them up. You can look up how to do them, but you still have to be able to implement that process yourself. So total of 7 questions in the practice set. This is what I would anticipate talking about at our review session tomorrow if you're able to attend, or if you want to watch the recording afterward. Once I post the recording, I'll also post an announcement telling you the recording's out there and telling you where you can find it. But I can show you now where that video will be once it exists tomorrow. Under the, there it is, the reference materials area. I will put the video right here after chapter 18, before chapter 19. So there'll be a link, another link added right here for that review session video if you're not able to join us tomorrow. No, unfortunately, no, sorry. The exam, the question in the classroom was, does the exam also have 7 questions? And the answer is no, definitely does not, but let's go look at the exam. The exam is not meant to be tricky. It's not a secret what's on there. It's not 7 questions, but it is 26 questions, but they're not all exercises. So as you can see, many of them are multiple choice. There are a few exercises. The multiple choice questions, for the most part, I expect you to be able to read the question and choose the correct answer. Most of the multiple choice questions are terminology related. They're not definitions, but they're concepts that you should already kind of have under your belt. The exercises, whoops, it's way too big. The exercises are going to look very familiar to you. They're very much in the same format that we used in the exercises in class, as well as in the practice set if you do those. Occasionally, there might be a question like this one that is a multiple choice, but it also does ask you to calculate something, but it's going to be a quick calculation. So the multiple choice are all designed to be done in basically less than a minute. But the exercises could take you 3, 4, 5 minutes to do, just like the ones that we've done in class. So a total of 26 questions. The split of the points between the 4 chapters is roughly the same. So there may not be exactly the same number of questions from each chapter, but each chapter contributes about the same percentage to your overall score. So anything else you were hoping to hear about the exam? And there's not anything in there that's designed to be tricky. I'm not trying to slide something in without you realizing, hey, wait, what's that doing on the test? There definitely could be questions that I may not have said exactly out loud in class, but all of the multiple choice questions are something that should have been covered in the reading and that we have at least, talked about to some degree in class as well. Okay, any questions? So you can take the exam now that we finished chapter 18. You are welcome to take the exam anytime after you submit the chapter 18 problem. If you have questions, if there's anything I can do to help, please let me know. If you are working on the exam and something happens, like your internet cuts out or you get kicked out of the exam, you accidentally click on the submit for grading button and you've only answered 2 questions or something like that, do not wait until class on Tuesday to tell me that. What you need to do is immediately send me an email to say something just happened, I got kicked out of the exam, or tell me whatever happened. Frequently, when there are those kinds of issues, I can just jump on a computer and fix it for you. If you accidentally submit it, I can reopen it. I can't fix your internet issues. But if that happens, you've only done 1 question and your internet kicks out and it doesn't come back on, let me know. Most of the time, I'm going to suggest that you have access to email, even if you don't have internet. If for some reason that's not the case, as soon as you have access, make sure you let me know. Waiting till Tuesday is really not a good idea. I will be much less sympathetic if you waited 4 days to tell me you had an issue. So touch base with me immediately. We'll figure out what we're going to do. And in many cases, I can just fix it and you can go back to working on the exam as you had planned. It's a 3-hour time window. Once you start the exam, the time keeps running. You can't, unlike everything else we do for class, you can't pause it. You can't save it for later. You have to take it all in one sitting, 3 hours from start to finish. That's way more time than anyone will likely spend on it. I know because I look at how long people take. So just let me know if you have any questions, comments, concerns, anything. I hope to see some of you at the review session tomorrow, but either way, you'll have access to the video after the fact. And what we're covering in class on Thursday is not on the exam.
So you gotta go on start.
Yes.